Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about the ethics of technology. Modern technology has become an enormously powerful force that can be used to cause harm just as easily as it can be used to do good. So what ethical principles can we apply to the use of technology to make sure it does more good than harm? Here to discuss this issue is my guest, Mehran Sahami. Dr. Sahami is a professor of computer science at Stanford University. He's a former senior research scientist at Google, and he's currently involved in designing courses for undergraduates that explore the relationship between ethics and technology. Mehran, great to have you on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
What would you say is the single biggest ethical dilemma facing scientists right now?
That's a great question, and unfortunately there is a lot more than one very large ethical dilemma facing scientists right now. To focus on the technology side, I would say that there's a couple dilemmas that we're looking at in the near term, and then some that are further out that we can explore. But in the near term, I'd say a big one is around algorithmic decision making, that we're building technologies that are making high stakes decisions about our lives, everything from medical care to resume screening and job hiring to criminal justice issues. And so when we think about algorithms making those decisions, it becomes imperative to understand what kind of data is being used in those algorithms, who's being affected by the decisions that are being made.
So a machine might decide whether you're worthy to receive a job interview based on your resume. A human wouldn't decide that, and that might be unfair?
Exactly, because the volume for some of these companies that are doing automated screening, part of the reason they're doing it is the volume of resumes they receive is just too great to have their HR department be able to actually go through them all. So they use automated methods to try to screen who might be applicable for an interview or not. And part of the problem with that is that the data that's used to train those algorithms is historical data that basically encodes a bunch of the biases of the humans that have made those decisions before. And as one example, Amazon, for example, had tried to build a resume screening system and found that it was systematically discriminating against women. And they had a bunch of their engineers try to figure out what was going on and correct the system, and ultimately they decided they couldn't do it, and they took the system down. So even technologically advanced companies like Amazon have real trouble sometimes grappling with these algorithmic issues.
Now, would this be solved by the marketplace? Because if you have the right algorithms, maybe you get the most qualified people. Is the goal to get the most qualified people, or is the goal to get a representative sample of the population?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, in some sense, what it comes down to are what are the outcomes you want to achieve. And part of the problem with some of the sampling is that we sort of get a one-sided error. We don't see the people who didn't get an interview, how they would have performed at the job. So one of the things we need to understand is better ways of being able to audit the results of these kind of algorithms, but also understanding that legally there are, for example, particular characteristics that are protected, like gender or race, that you can't make your hiring decision that discriminates based on those attributes. And it's not sufficient to just say, let's not include those attributes in the algorithm, because if the algorithm finds other things that encode that same information, as an example, from Amazon system, identifying particular colleges that are majority or all women or majority or all African American, you might not have race as an explicit feature for that resume, but there are other features that are essentially proxies for it.
Now, is this something that requires government intervention, where the government says, oh, you're hiring too many of the wrong kind of people, that's unacceptable, you have to fix that, or should we let the natural process run it?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you think about it, because the government already has made a declaration, right, with the Civil Rights Act of 1965 saying there are these protected attributes that you can't use for these hiring decisions. But more broadly is the question of, in technology, what's the kind of culture that we want to have? And there's a growing body of evidence that says if you have diverse teams, if you have multiple viewpoints, you get to technological solutions that are better because they're more inclusive for everyone. And so it's one of those places where not only can diversity be something that we think is a value to promote in itself, but it can also have beneficial market effects in terms of the kinds of technology that gets built.
Now, is more diversity always better than less diversity, or is it the right kind of diversity?
Well, what you want is a diversity of viewpoints. Right? So you want to have people who have different experiences, different backgrounds, bringing ideas to the table so that what you build are essentially technologies that are inclusive among a large group of people, right? In some sense, expanding your market. If you're just building something, say, for white men, then you've, by definition, limited your market. If you bring in other points of view that can take a look at, well, how might this technology get used in other contexts or be made more generalized, you can potentially reach both a market outcome and a social outcome that are more preferable.
Now, there are some specific types of technology which have a lot of ethical implications. For example, artificial intelligence, maybe blurring the line between humans and machines. What are some of the big ethical decisions that have to be made regarding AI?
Sure. So, if we can think of different instantiations of AI, so algorithmic decision making, you could think of one where machine learning is used to train the algorithm. Another big one right now is facial recognition. So from photographs or from video, trying to identify not just that there is a face there, but who that person is. And so that can be fun if we have pictures in our favorite social networking application to identify who was with us at a particular event. It's not so much fun when it's used as a surveillance mechanism, for example, to understand where we were at any given point in time. And so, you can think of different instantiations. China, for example, uses facial recognition as part of trying to identify individuals for their social credit score. And you might say, well, in democratic nations, we might not do the same thing. Well, it turns out London has 500,000 closed-circuit television cameras outside. And if you were to apply facial recognition technology to that, you would get a pretty good sense of where a lot of people are, at least outdoors at any given time.
Well, it's good for tracking criminals. Is the benefit you gain from keeping tabs on criminals worth what you might lose by having everyone's privacy compromised to some degree?
That's a great question. What it gets down to is, for a lot of these ethical questions, at the heart of them lies a value tension. And so, for example, one of the value tensions in facial recognition is the tension between security and privacy. And we could think of a simple example of that value tension every time we go to the airport and we go through screening, right? We're willing to give up some privacy to get our baggage x-rayed because we believe the security is important for us, and the amount of privacy we're giving up at that point is small enough. But if you go to the other extreme, where you could say, well, the government mandates we install cameras in everyone's house so we can see what you're doing at any given time to see if you're engaging in criminal activity. That gets us a different level of security than we have now, but we've given up a lot of privacy to do it.
Well, a police agency might have the sense that everybody looks like a criminal until proven otherwise. So should we assume the worst of people, or should we give credit innocent until proven guilty? You assume the best of people until you have a reason to think otherwise.
Right. So, getting to the regulation point is the notion that some of these ideas, like guilty until, or innocent until proven guilty, are something that's already been codified. So if we try to think about our technologies being able to basically work in parallel with those kind of ideas. And there's examples of that. For example, when, say, someone who had a criminal past might be released on parole. In some cases, they actually have to wear a monitoring device, right? So their privacy, they have lost some amount of privacy because of their previous activity.
Maybe their neighbors need to be informed that they're living next door to them.
Exactly. And so we already have laws that account for some cases of this. And the issue is, as technology continues to advance pretty rapidly, how can our regulation keep up?
Another area of technology that has a lot of ethical import is genomics, modifying the genome, even modifying the human genome in an attempt to improve on the original design. What would be some of the ethical problems with that?
Well, there's lots of ethical problems, and I should say that medical ethics and specifically the genome is not particularly my area of expertise. But you could think of the ethical issues in when we think about these larger phenomena is, what are the outcomes that we are comfortable with, right? What does ethics represent? It represents some notion of what we think of as right and wrong. And when enough people get together and agree on what the notions of right and wrong are, we can turn those into laws, at least in democratic states. But when we try to understand regulation of particular technologies or particular scientific advances like gene editing, it gets down to, what are we comfortable with? Societally, would we be comfortable with editing people's DNA if it meant we could end particular genetic diseases?
Now, people have different comfort levels. Some people are comfortable with things that other people are not comfortable with. Maybe one group shouts louder than the other. Doesn't necessarily mean their view is more widespread. So Do we just respond to pressure, whatever the crowd thinks? That's the direction we go in?
Well, I think there's different levels you could think of that issue around. So one is collective decision making, which in a democracy, in a functioning democracy, right, you could think of people through voting mechanisms bring in representatives who are going to espouse their points of view. Right? And that's a way where all of these individual preferences and there's differences at some point emerge into some collective preference that gets turned into law. But there's also cases where individuals have agency to do other things other than just voting. So for example, in our class that we teach at Stanford on technology and ethics, we have students in there who have computer science backgrounds. Some are philosophy, some are public policy. What we want them to all come away with is that as individuals, they have agency to do things, right? The engineers can choose where they work or how they bring up issues at a company. The philosophers can focus on what are the questions that they want to rise to bring to public consciousness to think about. The folks involved in public policy will become staffers or become decision makers themselves who can decide or bring up issues as to what lawmakers should be trying to address. So everyone has different kinds of expertise they can apply, but at the end of the day, we're also all citizens and can still vote.
But you want them to at least consider things. So in these classes that you're designing and teaching, you want them to at least be aware that ethical issues exist and need to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. And so one of the really fun parts about this class is it's co-taught with myself and then Rob Reich, who's a moral philosopher, and Jeremy Weinstein, who's in the political science department and works in public policy. He was actually part of the Obama administration for a while. And so these are the different viewpoints we present to students as we think about what are philosophical frameworks in terms of the different problems and issues we address in the class. We do a technology deep dive to think about what's possible, what's coming, how do we think about ways that the technology itself can try to bring up ways of regulating itself in some sense, not in the legal sense, but in the notion of how do we develop technologies to mitigate their really bad effects.
Well, some technologies benefit some people, but disbenefit others. For example, you build robots that can do certain jobs faster and cheaper and better than humans. So that's good for the company, but it's bad for the people who lose their jobs. So is it unethical to produce machines that put people out of work?
It's a great question, and part of what it brings up is the notion of how do we respond to that, right? So we've gone through these kinds of technological revolutions in the past, like the Industrial Revolution, right? There was a point in time 100 years ago where 90% of the population was involved in farming. Right now it's around 2%. Right? So what did we do during that period of time? What we did was we did things like put a huge emphasis on compulsory education, of thinking about job retraining and different sorts of ways that we could think about new classes of labor.
And new industries opened up.
And new industries opened up, exactly. So some new industries will open up, but if you look at some of the current estimates, depending on who you read, somewhere between 9 and 45% of jobs are at risk of automation in the next 10 to 20 years. Which is a pretty large number if we think of the current unemployment rate in the US is around 4%. So part of the question is how do we respond to that? And if we can already see this coming down the line, we should be putting a lot more emphasis into educational programs, into job retraining, and into promoting what we think are the areas that really have growth opportunities.
One of the issues in ethics is what does the government owe to people? So if you're not making a living, is it the government's job to provide you with that living? Some people are talking about something called universal basic income, UBI, where everybody gets a check from the government every month and they don't have to do anything for it. Do you think that's an ethical thing to do, or is it more ethical to tell people that you must succeed on your own effort because there's no safety net and then they'll work harder?
Right, and this is one of the questions that's come up. So people are actively researching universal basic income to see what are the effects, because some people believe, well, if you give people a guaranteed level of income, they're going to sit around, they're going to do nothing because they're just going to get this check from the government. And they've run some, relatively small scale, but still, reasonable experiments in Stockton, a few other places. And what they found is that people don't just sit around. They still want to engage in meaningful work. They still want to do things that they think have value in their life. What the universal basic income provides for them is more of a cushion to be able to achieve those ends. And so I think certainly more research is needed to understand where the trade-offs are. But part of it's also how do you set up a social structure that still rewards innovation and hard work, but that provides some level of safety net, because it may turn out our notions of the 40-hour or 60-hour work week become antiquated at some point.
Now, social media also has a lot of ethical issues. There's a lot of pressure to suppress certain types of speech, for example, hate speech. So how do you deal with ethics? Like, are there some ideas that are too dangerous to be expressed, or should you just let all the ideas out there and let the public figure out what they believe? And who decides which ideas should be suppressed?
That's a great question, because it brings up one of the things we talk about in the class, which is the power of private platforms. Right now, the questions of who gets free speech on Twitter or Facebook are determined by executives at Facebook and Twitter. Right? Normally, we think of the notion of free speech as being a right guaranteed by the government. But if you have a private corporation that's able to make those decisions how they choose, there isn't a lot of recourse from the population or the electorate to change where those guidelines are. So one of the things, for example, that has come up is some of these big tech companies asking the government to actually regulate, because they don't want to be strapped with the responsibility of deciding what content is allowed and what is not. So they'd like the government to tell them what that is. And this is one of those places where we need to have more interaction between lawmakers and the tech companies to understand how we can create these regulations in a way that really works.
Yeah. It's like no matter what regulations you make regarding that, a lot of people aren't going to like it. Mm-hmm. So if you pass it to the government, people will still be angry, but they'll be angry at the government, not at you.
I mean, from the standpoint of the technology companies, that's absolutely right. So there is some notion of deflection there. But without taking the overly cynical view of it, I think the other way we can also think about it is the government regulating it provides a level of recourse for the electorate, right? It provides a way for people in that region or in the country, whatever sort of locality you think about having control, to be able to express their preferences for what's acceptable and what's not. And so one of the examples you can see of that right now is that Facebook has made this decision that they will allow political ads even if there's falsehoods in them. You could probably imagine the majority of the country actually thinks that's probably the wrong decision, but they don't have a recourse in that right now.
Well, maybe they want to start small, limit it as little as possible, and if it's indicated to limit it more, then do it instead of just starting with a big axe and just chopping away too much. I think maybe they want to do a little bit more of a gradual approach and see how that goes.
Yeah, there are different ways to think about it. I mean, part of the question, too, is also how do you do the regulation? Do you try to come up with algorithmic methods because you think that's what scales? Do you try to have a whole army of content regulators that look at things? Some of these companies do that. They employ very large numbers of people to look at content and try to determine what is not acceptable. And the really shocking part of some of this is some of the content people try to put up is really just awful material, right? People being beheaded, all kinds of things. And so some of the content moderators actually are showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, because if you spend 8 hours a day looking at really horrible content, you can't just turn that off when you go home. And so part of that is how do we think about that regulation happening?
And with the internet, it's international, so everybody in the world can see it. What would be acceptable viewing in one culture might be totally unacceptable in another one. So how do you deal with that?
Well, what the companies are doing now is they're, basically trying to adhere to the regulations in different countries. So, for example, in Germany, there's very strict regulations around Nazi-related content. Right? So, for example, what you would find on Google when you search for Nazi content in Germany will be different than the United States. And perhaps the most extreme example of that is China, that wanted to have pretty stringent content regulation, and ultimately some companies just decided it was too much and wouldn't want to do business there.
Should we basically assume that people can handle information? Is the presumption that people are mature enough to handle it, or is it more that people have to be protected from the wrong ideas because they're not smart enough to realize that this is a wrong idea and they can easily be manipulated?
So I think the interesting issue there is I do believe that people can handle exposure to a broad range of ideas. The key is for them to actually get that broad range of ideas rather than being trapped in an information bubble where they just continue to see information that reinforces their own viewpoint.
Well, as far as the people you friend on Facebook or the people you follow on Facebook, don't you choose to be in your own bubble?
Right, but that's, part of the issue is you may have a bunch of friends on Facebook, and actually I have friends all across the political spectrum. But what I tend to see in terms of content is content that tends to agree with me. And this is just, we actually do an assignment in our class related to this, where you could think about say if a company is trying to maximize click-through rate on content because of advertising opportunities every time someone clicks on something. What are you likely to show someone? You're likely to show someone things that they're more likely to click on, which are often things that they're more likely to agree with, one, or are more extreme content. They're just outrageous, so they want to see what it is. And if what we're seeing is just the things that either reinforce our beliefs or the most extreme content on the internet, we're not really getting the broad range of information.
Now, don't they recognize the problem? I mean, on Facebook, I think they pretty much stay on top of all these problems. They understand the problem. They know it's a complicated problem. They're trying to solve it. I mean, some people seem to think there's an evil conspiracy going on to rob you of something. I mean, what do you think of these basically honest people who are trying to do the best job with a very complex problem that has no easy solutions?
Yeah, I don't believe in a conspiracy. I don't believe they're ill-intentioned people. I actually have some very good friends at all of the large tech companies. And by and large, I think they're very well-intentioned people who are trying to do the right thing with hard problems. But the one thing I also think about with respect to that is kind of this, somewhat Rawlsian view of justice, which has this view that says, it's one thing where you have a company where it's run by people that you just trust to do the right thing. But what if you took that same company and removed all those people and put in 5 people that you don't trust to do the right thing, or that have very diametrically opposed views than you do? What's the regulation you would want to have in place to prevent them from doing the really horrible things? And if you would want regulation in those cases, you should be willing to accept it even when your friends are running the company.
Now, how much influence does ethical thought have on tech companies? Because you have the imperative of making money, so how much consideration is given to ethics compared to the amount of consideration given to making a really nice profit?
Sure. Well, there's lots of places where we think about ethical values that take lots of different forms that will, we might choose to have something where it's more important to have what we think of as an ethical outcome rather than just profit maximization. So you could think of antitrust legislation, for example, as being in that vein. But there's lots of other places, too, where we trade off values. We could make all cars drive 10 miles an hour, and we'd have a lot fewer road casualties. But we're willing to make that trade-off and allow cars to go faster because some of the efficiency we gain out of the system is something that we've been willing to accept that trade-off. I mean, despite the fact that it costs about 50,000 lives per year in the United States, which is a pretty extreme cost.
Now, another ethical issue is defense work. Some people don't like to work on weapon systems. A number of people at Google objected vociferously when Google wanted to make a contract with the Defense Department, and I think they canceled it. So what are the ethics of that? On the one hand, weapon systems kill people. On the other hand, we have real enemies, unless you believe that all enemies are just misunderstood friends. Different philosophy there. So is there anything wrong with working on weapon systems if you believe that you need to have them because the other side is developing them?
That comes down to a lot of issues of personal preference. And I think one of the interesting times right now in Silicon Valley is the competition for talent at these companies is so high that they are actually spending more time listening to what their employees want and how they're expressing those preferences through things like walkouts or letters to management or whatever the case may be. And so if a group of people at Google decide that they don't want the company working on military applications, and that's a large enough group that's vocal enough about the action that they would take if the company continues, the company will respond. Now, there's other cases, for example, where the company is run mostly by government contracts. And so people who've chosen to work at that company have made a choice about the kind of work they want to do and what they want to support. And some of those companies are very vocal about how it's the obligation of engineers to work on government contracts or on projects that the government's trying to promote because that government was democratically elected and these are the decisions they're making. And the issue comes down to when someone's personal preferences differ from the government decisions, the individual still has agency to make a choice about what they want to work on.
Because some people question the ethics of working for the government at all. The assumption is that maybe there's something wrong with the government is bad. We understand it when people in other countries think their governments are bad, but here we kind of expect people to think that our government, for the most part, is good. So what do we do with that information? Is that an ethical issue, like what you think of the government determines whether you want to work for it or not? Or is it the country is bigger than the government and you're working for the country?
Well, you can think about what are the policies that the government is currently trying to promote, right? So at one level, we can appreciate our government because we have a process around it, right? We have a democracy where we can say we have the opportunity to change the government if we don't believe that they're acting in our best interest. But at the same time, there's that personal choice to say, for a particular administration, I may not agree with what they're doing. And in that situation, I may not want to partake in promoting any of the policies or some of the policies that they're trying to espouse.
Do you think that ethics is largely a matter of culture? We only have about a minute left, so I don't want to ask a really complicated question here.
Sure.
But is it really a matter of culture and a consensus in the culture? Is that what defines a nation, a common culture, basically? And if you don't have it, you're in trouble.
That's absolutely true, because what ethics is at the end of the day is people's notions of what's right and wrong. And what their notions of what's right and wrong is very much colored by their history, by their experiences, and that's what makes a culture. So that's absolutely true. There's also been experiments along these lines, for example, to see in different sorts of countries or different societies what's valued, and some of the values are very different, which expresses a difference in terms of what is believed to be ethical.
But do we have to deal with diversity? Different cultures see things different ways. Should we be open to different ways of looking at things instead of a monoculture?
Well, we should always be open to different ways of looking at things, because just because we're a democracy doesn't necessarily mean we have the best culture, right? We should always be open to different ideas. And, part of that is trying to understand where our place is, where our culture and our processes and our democracy can be better.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap right now. I have a lot more questions, but we're out of time. So I'd like to thank you for being here today, Mehran Sahami. Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Martin Wasserman, and we'll see you next time.